All right. There is a question for you on the screen if you want to put your answer in the chat. I'll give you a moment to do that. While you're doing that, I'm Abby. I'm teaching in person at Ramsey County Correctional Facility. We were basically shut down, just working from home, but not with students for a few months. Came back in August. And our program is pretty small right now. My colleague is teaching about, I think about like 11 students or something like this, 14, and I've got 3 on my roster right now. Give you a moment. Interesting. Yeah, when we were prepping for this session, Tracy, there were people saying like it was hard to prep the session because things were going to be changing quickly in the next few weeks. So if you're comfortable, I'd love for you to have your camera on. If that's not comfortable, that's okay. It should look like this, so probably at the bottom of your screen. So today's session is about what it's like teaching in person right now in November of 2020. And although our focus will be on some of the instructional challenges we're facing, we'll spend the beginning part of the session just thinking about some of the context and constraints of how things are going right now so that can frame our conversation. I clearly don't have all the answers. I like to think about when I'm in the conferences what the theme of the conference could be. And I think about the sessions I got to go to, I feel like there's like a theme of like, there's no need for us to start from scratch, although we're all trying to figure it out. So I had the great opportunity to talk to a bunch of teachers from all over the state who are teaching in person, who are super generous in sharing their ideas. I did compile some of their ideas into a document that you'll get at the end of the session. And we'll talk about some of the real gems as we go through the session too. All right, so towards the end of the session, we'll have a chance to go into breakout groups and discuss some of the big common questions that have come up. So I want to give my thanks to these very generous, smart teachers who each spent time talking with me about how things are going for them in person and sharing some of their best ideas and advice, and also sharing what they did that didn't work and questions that they still have. In the slideshow, you'll see some art from amplifier.org. I found them when I was looking for COVID-related posters for my classroom, so kind of reminders. So that will be also in the resource page. Oh, I want to thank Andy and Marisa who are doing the tech. I know so many of us are doing online classes by ourselves, trying to handle the tech and the instruction, and it's such a treat to have 2 people stuff, so thank you. I also, as long as I'm doing thank yous, want to thank you. What a difficult year for lots of reasons, and what a difficult year to be teaching. If you had told me in January that we were going to have like a month to turn around, my partner's sneezing, sorry, I don't know if you can hear. We're going to have a month to turn around creating online instruction and really changing the way that we do in-person instruction, I would have said it was impossible. And so many teachers have been so creative under really stressful times. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for staying in it. You know who you are. There's so many teachers that are really making sure that the focus remains on the students and on really high quality instruction. So, I can't appreciate you enough. All right, so in a moment, Andy is going to put a link to a document that looks like this in the chat. And what I'd like you to do is just dump into this document all the questions that you have about in-person instruction right now. I'm sure there's a lot of questions. I don't know if you're like me. And then I'm sure we won't get to answer all of them, but at least we can kind of look for some common threads. Thanks, Marisa. So there's a spot for you to write questions about instruction, another spot for questions about procedures, a spot for questions about materials, and then a spot for any other questions. Great questions. Oh, I love questions. This is so exciting. So we've got how much of online instruction is retained by students? How are programs determining conditions that require them to close? How are we physically spacing out students? How do you get restarted after doing packets for 7 months? Are you doing hybrid, and how do you manage both at the same time? Great questions. Okay. Some of these questions will get answered during the session, and some of them hopefully can come up during the discussion at the end. Our focus is instructional, so we're not going to go deep into logistics, but the document you'll get at the end does have suggestions from teachers about spreading folks out. And this session actually started because on one of the Schoology groups, I had posted asking, when I knew I was going back into the facility, I had posted asking folks to for advice, to talk to me about what they were doing, what they were planning. And then it was suggested that we share here as well. So hopefully we can keep using Schoology to discuss the questions that we won't be able to get to in 1 hour. All right. Yes. All right. So come back to here. So I'm sure you'll hear me say this the wrong way, but one thing I'm trying to do is not say returning to the classroom or returning to teaching in person. I'm just saying moving to in person or teaching in person, because I think we're not returning to what we were doing in the beginning of the calendar year. And I think it's misleading, partly to our supervisors and to our students, to suggest that we're going back to the same thing we were doing. Which takes us to our first gem. I'm not sure if Britt's on here, but I'll give you a moment to read this over. So here's some words from a teacher that I follow on Twitter. So we're going to be talking about some common themes that came up from teachers. And in those common themes, there are obviously layers and layers of stuff that is just beyond what we're going to address within our classrooms. Students' access to technology, students having space at home to do what they need to do, access to healthcare, adequate childcare. There's so many layers to the situation that we find ourselves in right now. And I do think it's helpful to imagine what we do as a society with some unlimited resources. And I think it's definitely time to think outside the box. So here's our second gem, another insight from one of our teachers, this question of why. And this came up a lot when I was talking to different teachers who are teaching in person. Why is a useful question for change, right? If I can think about why I'm doing something, if I can consider the purpose, it becomes more clear what's easy to let go of and what has to stay at the center of what we're doing. So maybe you've heard the ham story, and I recently learned that for some religious traditions, it's the brisket story. So you might have heard it differently, but the story that I've heard is that there's a person who's making ham for a big family dinner, and they go to cut the butt off the ham and throw it away. And when they look at it, they think, well, this looks like a perfectly good piece of meat. I wonder why it has to be thrown away. But that's how their dad had taught them to cook it. So they call their dad and say, why do we throw the butt of the ham away? And he says, I don't know, but that's the way your grandmother taught me. So they call grandma and she says, you guys are ridiculous and you're wasting perfectly good ham. When your dad was little, our pan was too small. So many programs and some teachers have considered going to an in-person model again and decided not to do that. And I think it's really easy to take for granted that what we need to do is do what we've always done. And it may not be the time to do that. So kudos to all the programs that have made thoughtful decisions in really challenging times. So the first question I think that we need to ask is why would we go back in person? What is the purpose of having the students in person in the classroom? And that's not a rhetorical question, but it's also not one that we're going to answer here today, although I hope that all programs are really deeply considering this question. I talked to, like I said, several programs, and I think there were really diverse reasons that programs had for why they felt in-person instruction was the best thing right now. But I hope that programs are starting there by saying, is that what we need to do? So I'm in a social group, a very informal social group, and we get together once a month and we rotate who has to coordinate the monthly meeting. And so of course, in March, we switched over to we're meeting remotely. And over this summer, and I'm sure some of you can relate to this, people started to feel like it was time to meet in person. People were itching to see each other. And I was responsible for the August meeting. So with some support from the person who had the meeting before me, I did the surveys, I asked different people what they were comfortable with. I looked at what the health department was recommending, and we had these small meeting groups where we group people by how, what they were comfortable with. Everything was allowed for social distancing. There was a remote option. I was super proud of what I had created. And a person who's in the group, who happens to be an epidemiologist, pointed out that I had totally lost the plot. And she said, it's not supposed to be, because I was like, I got everyone what they wanted. And she was like, Abby, it's not about what people want. It's about reducing community spread. That was helpful for me to hear. We do have a responsibility to prevent illness. There are serious long-term effects. We don't want folks to get sick. So it's helpful for me to think about part of our why is a shared responsibility for everyone's health. So I think the question is, how can our purpose be satisfied in ways that are most likely to prevent community spread of the virus? And this is really complicated. I can speak for myself and say that my access to healthcare is often more privileged than a lot of my students. I have privileges that allow me to engage in social distancing in the rest of my life in a way that many of my students don't. By the nature of some of our students' jobs or housing, they're going to come to contact with a lot more people than we are, and all those things have to be taken into consideration. So all of that said, today we're going to talk about in-person instruction and what that looks like. And I got to speak to all of those really clever teachers, and I compiled a list of some of the logistical things. So procedures, classroom setup, their recommendations around managing materials, understandings that they would wish they had gotten with their colleagues or supervisors before they started. And there's also links to the Minnesota Department of Health recommendations and the CDC's recommendations for schools. So you'll get that document at the end, and hopefully that will be useful to you. I don't know that any of us has all the answers, and I know for sure that the teachers I spoke with would say they're figuring it out, but it gives you a place to start. All right, so I'm going to go through a couple of those recommendations because I think they are helpful in framing the rest of our conversation. So one is to think about shared items and minimizing everyone's contact with them. So that could be a doorknob, it could be a dictionary, it could be the dice in a math game that you play. And the choices are you remove that item from the classroom, you change procedures or activities so you reduce who's having contact with that item, or you have some procedure in place where the item's being sanitized between people using it. If you know me, you know that I love math games. And so I have all these games that involve cards and dice. And I was really desperate to continue to play those games when I started teaching in person. And the person who's giving me advice, an epidemiologist relative of mine said, I said, oh, well, maybe I'll have the students sanitize their hands. We'll play the game and they can sanitize their hands again. And she said, can you prevent them from rubbing their eyes while they're playing the game? So I can't. So the dice, I had to modify what I was doing with them. All right. So another constraint to duties, because we can't have staff doing many things at the same time, but the time runs out. So there's going to be more cleaning, and whether that is assigned to administrators or coordinators or teachers or janitors, they either need some of their duties switched out or they need additional paid time to do that work. Dakota Prairie ABE is paying their teachers for half an hour per day for their cleaning time. Other programs have asked students to clean their own area before they leave. And even if you're gonna have a staff clean after them, that is suggested that might be a way to reduce the exposure that your staff are having. Because if the student do the cleaning first, the idea is the teacher then gets less exposure. So if teachers and students are doing the cleaning, then is that a reduction in instructional time? Or is that a longer time that we expect the students to be in the classroom? So here's another gem from one of the teachers. So we're teachers, we're not new to managing classroom behavior, and clear expectations are obviously really important. Managing more expectations around health and safety. I think it needs to be really explicit to our students what we expect. I got to speak to a relative of mine who's an epidemiologist, and her recommendation was masks on at all times. I talked with her about what many teachers brought up, which was that we're used to having our students be allowed to eat and drink in our classrooms, and she strongly recommended against that. She said that maybe schools could have a room where a student could go in by themselves if a student needs to eat or drink something, but she really recommends not having folks have masks off in the classroom. She also recommended having some sort of structures around hand washing and alcohol-based sanitizer if possible. I know in some of our settings, because of students' history of addiction, that's a challenge. For my setting, we're allowed to spray the hand sanitizer on their hands as long as we limit the amount. And the students wearing the mask properly, we've all been to the grocery store, we've seen people wearing masks in really strange ways. I will say overall, and probably not surprising, every teacher that I spoke with said that their students are wearing masks and have been very compliant. The teachers in Elk River said that they have had some experience with students who expressed they did not believe in masks, but when the teachers framed it as, well, would you be willing to wear it for the comfort of the students around you? Students complied. Almost every teacher has posted visuals around their classroom reminding students of some of the new health expectations. Some of the teachers have come up with a specific gesture they use. They can give students a nonverbal cue to put their mask back on or to put it on in the correct way. And being consistent seems to be the key. Like if it's just consistently like an expectation, then it seems to be going all right. I'll give you a minute. So I think this is true with most of the times when we set rules, right? Things wear down over time. And most of us said that we had found that over time, things loosened up. So the epidemiologist that I got to speak with said that it might be smart for staff to build in ways where they're going to sort of check in on what the expectations were and make sure that they're resetting themselves to hold the expectation at the level they agreed upon. It can feel really awkward. You know, you have a student that walks in with a cup of coffee or a bagel to tell them that they can't eat it. or for me, I was really wanting to play those games that I really think are effective tools. Um, so she recommended remembering that there are students in the room who came because they were comfortable what you expressed were going to be the minimum standards. And if I let that one student have his mask off, and there might be someone sitting near them that is then left with the option of either leaving, sitting in more risk than they felt comfortable with, or having to confront me or the student. All right. I also asked what things, if there were things that if COVID magically went away tomorrow, that teachers had changed, they would keep doing. And there were a lot of those. Updating student contact information. Most of the in-person programs said that they had learned in the spring that they did not have complete contact information, and what a challenge that was. And also recently, some of the in-person programs have had to do contact tracing. And if a student came in, registered, and never came back, they did not have the full contact information for the student. So making sure that that contact information is being updated as regularly as possible, and getting enough contact information on day one were high recommendations. This one's instructional, but most teachers mentioned clearing out what they had in their classroom. Makes it easier to clean the room. It reduces the shared contact. And most people said that they have found that that is actually, as a result, it's better. So these are photos. Britt Gulstrand might be in the meeting, and Sherry Smith from Elk River and I all have shifted from having shared materials, so a bin of pencils that students can help themselves to, a shelf of books where there's a classroom set, to bins that students are specifically assigned. And I had never considered this before, but I love it. I will not go back the other way. So students get their own assigned bin. They use those materials for the duration while they're enrolled. And then when they leave, the materials are, if they're disposable, are given to the student or tossed. If they're reused, then they're sanitized and then they're put back into the rotation. I don't know what this says about our classrooms before, but everyone I spoke to, for sure, were like, wow, my classroom was really dirty before. I can honestly tell you that I never wiped my bookshelf before March. So everyone was like, cleaning, I'm definitely going to keep up my cleaning routine, even if COVID is no longer an issue. The community programs mentioned that they are expecting to come in and out of being in person. So a lot of those programs are looking at how they can use the time they have with the students to build up the tech skills, so they'll be more prepared for when they're going to be working remotely. I don't know how sustainable this is, but most of us right now are having smaller class sizes and obviously enjoying it while we have it. Okay, there are also a lot of common threads that came up as I spoke to folks. So we'll run through a few of those and then we'll talk about instruction within these constraints. I'm sure that folks who are teaching online have the same feeling, but people are feeling that they're just needing to have more planning and more planful time, kind of being more deliberate about some of the things that happened that felt more organic before. Partly because students can't move as much, partly because some of the things that were around the room to cue students about things are gone, partly because some of the materials can't be reused. So Rosie Sharkey and Dakota Prairie said that she has all these like sentence strips she has ESL students order sentences from, and now she has to make them, the students use them once and the students take them home, and so she's just doing a lot more prep. So smaller class sizes, students being more set in their spot, and then there was only one program I spoke to that had brought volunteers into the classroom, and they only allowed one. So a real reduction in how many volunteers we have for support. Some folks did have positive things to say about the reduced reduction in volunteers. Programs said that the teachers were noticing more control over the instructional implementation. Some teachers felt it was less prep without the volunteers. And some teachers mentioned that they had more insight into how students were doing because they were working directly with them. But obviously, there is a loss when we don't have our volunteers with us. The teachers teaching English language learners always mentioned that teaching pronunciation through a mask is really challenging. I see someone shaking their head. One teacher trying see-through masks. One teacher is going to start doing videos of herself with some of the pronunciation, so she can show the video, obviously without a mask, and then she can show the video while she's masked in front of the students. But I do think pronunciation as a whole, it's a really something that folks are going to have to figure out. That's a challenge. Maybe ironically, the teachers who said that their instruction was the least changed were the ones that were using the most tech before things started. So teachers who said that their students were already, most of the time before COVID, sitting in front of a single computer doing something by themselves, felt that their students had the least disruption in person right now. And even for teachers who maybe taught in a different way, things like video offering, distance learning platforms, online learning, technology like Google Docs as a way to do shared writing. All of those pieces seem to be really helpful when you're teaching in person. So even though I think some teachers are eager to move from remote learning to in person because they are not comfortable with the tech, I think the tech is going to be a solution either way. Years ago, I worked for the Minnesota Literacy Council, and Jessica Grace Jones did some really amazing things with very beginning level ESL learners using Google Docs as a way to do shared writing and to practice that communication. They would be in the same classroom, but they would each have a computer and be writing to each other. And I wonder if some of those structures are going to be helpful as we try to teach students who are kind of stuck in locations around the room. For me personally, without my volunteers, I'm finding that flipping instruction, so having a student watch a video, having a student do an activity on Desmos, having a student do something where I've recorded a screencast is helpful, because at a time where I would have said to my volunteer, hey, Sharon, can you show so-and-so X? I don't have Sharon, but I can say, hey, why don't you go watch the video on X, and then I'll come see you and we'll check in about it. I also, as long as we're talking about tech, wanted to mention that I think there might be potential for, and I know this is complicated with contact hours, but for regions and even within regions to think about, are there ways that we could be accessing other teachers' remote classes? Teachers would mention like one student who wanted an intermediate ESL class and there wasn't a way to serve them in the current in-person setup. And I wonder if we could be somehow setting those students up to get the services from other programs. I know it's hard to give up the contact hours and send them to another program, but if the services are not, if it's a service we cannot offer, I wonder if there's a way to meet that. And I've even been thinking, like, I've been watching AEOA has Melissa Biscorum has a consumer education program, and we don't offer anything like that. And I thought, oh, if she's doing that remotely, why couldn't I just have my students do that with? I think there's some potential for some real interesting collaboration if we can get creative. So those are some of the common threads, but of course, everyone had common challenges as well. Everyone consistently reported that students are, because of we're trying to stay out of each other's 6-foot bubbles, students are much more stuck at their seats. Students are doing individual kind of reading and writing and listening from their seat. And teachers are more stationary too, although I will say every single teacher that I spoke with said that they were in and out of their students' 6-foot bubble all day. Many teachers are hand sanitizing every time they leave a student, because we're likely to be the ones spreading illness between our students as we move between them. And then everyone had questions about what does it look like for best practice when we're 6 feet apart. A lot of the commonly used best practice, turn and talk, card sorts, hands-on games and puzzles, small group work is challenging when the students are apart. And for students who don't feel confident, having to speak loudly 6 feet apart can also be an added barrier. And then the third big challenge was engagement in classroom culture. And again, almost every single person I spoke to brought this up. Teachers talked about that their new students seem to feel less bonded to the group and less, it was harder to make them feel welcome as the teacher or to build up a relationship with them as the teacher. Teachers mentioned students feeling less ownership over the classroom, maybe because some of the small tasks they sort of helped the classroom with were gone or changed. building an environment of fun for learning. Some of the items that teachers had around for that have been put away. And some of the more like fun enrichment activities aren't accessible or feasible in the way that things are running right now. I think I'm noticing personally that there may be also an impact of students not being able to see my facial expressions. I work with a lot of students who are primary English speakers who grew up in the US educational system and had a really bad experience. And anything I can do to cue them that it's okay, that we're at peace, that they're doing well. I think for some of them, there has been a loss that they can't see that I'm expressing it with a smile, that they can't pick up all the cues about that. All right. So that brings us to some questions that I hope we can talk about today. I do have some ideas that I've gathered from the teachers, but I'd like to hear what you're thinking too. So I'll give you a moment to read this slide. I'd like you to think about which questions you'd like to discuss as you go into your breakout group. I see some other corrections folks here. I think our students especially have so little control over their lives, and we have even more things that we're asking them. We're telling them what they need to do. So I'm really interested in how you help students feel in control when there's more limits around them. Whichever questions that are most pressing to you, again, with that frame of why, like what is the primary purpose of what we're doing? And then coming into some of these questions. So Marisa is going to put us in breakout rooms for about 10 minutes. And what I'd like you to do is put your mic and camera on, talk with the people in your group. And we're going to put a link to this document, which has the questions in it. And you'll be able to, as a group, talk about some of the questions and then drop your answers in the appropriate spot underneath the questions, so that we can kind of share and kind of some of the ideas you have. And then we can come back and we'll debrief and talk a little bit about ideas and maybe other questions that have come up. Back. All right, thanks guys. Hopefully had some good conversations. I'd love to kind of hear back from some of you. There are a few notes in that document. Let's see. So the first question about creating opportunities for student choice and control. I wonder if there's anyone who would want to share what their group talked about in terms of this question. You can just unmute yourself and share if you'd like to do that.
Okay, I'll just jump in and say,
Hi, Randy.
Hi, I'm Randy Evans. And personally, I work in a jail, and I just, so couple of conversations, two people, I think, kind of express this fact that our population is much smaller than it was. And it is face-to-face. In my particular situation, I don't have any danger of COVID inside at the jail at this point, nor has there been since the beginning, where others have had COVID infections. So there's that issue. But and I think, but what we were talking about is that with the smaller class sizes, it's more opportunity to have more intimate individual choice and conversations around learning and the emotional impact of that process, given the smaller class size. So the limitations of not having as much interactive hands-on manipulatives is kind of, in a way, counterbalanced with a much more personal relationship opportunities during the teaching process.
Nice, thank you. Is there anyone else?
Hello. In our group, we some people have talked about, and I work in a prison and we're currently on lockdown, and I haven't seen students in my classroom for months and months and months. And other people, they're in another school, they were doing, they want to have the little people, like preschoolers, have a chance in school. So for the adults, they don't have the adults come in, so the little people can come in and have time. And another one is really close to the border states where they're having a lot of COVID. So it's like their conversation is not just about their area and even our state of Minnesota, but what's happening to the state besides them, whether or not they're going to have students in the classroom. But that's a district by district choice. So it's like we're very different, very, very different in everything that's happening.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I feel like it's such a complicated time, and there are so many variables. I'm glad you guys got to talk about some of those issues. I know it can also be really isolating to feel like you're the only person doing whatever the thing is. For my students, I'm not sure why, and I know that Britt and I have both felt like our students, for some reason, the class period feels long to them, and I think reducing the number of things that they can control and manipulate makes it feel longer. For most of my students, it's a one-room schoolhouse kind of feel, so they have tasks that rotate who I'm doing a lesson with, and they're working independently and they have kind of a choice of things to do. And some of my students have a harder time managing that. And I've made schedules for them where I've said, like, do this, then do this. And I'm trying to mix it up, like, do this one player game, then do this reading activity. And I realized that is actually an ACEs skill that I'm doing for them instead of teaching them how to do. So I've shifted to talking to them about, like, we've been calling it lighter and heavier, because harder and easier that didn't translate well, didn't make sense to them. But like, what feels lighter to you and what feels like a really heavy task, and try alternating them, or try doing 2 lights and 1 heavy. And then looking at, so they can see on the screen, I'm having some of the students use this as they work through their day, and then talking about afterwards, like how it went, and what they might structure differently the next day. And I've been surprised, actually, the students using this sheet are doing what I would perceive as harder work than what I would have given them if I had made the schedule myself. And they seem happier. They're staying longer in terms of, because they can choose to leave. They're staying longer in the class period, and they're getting more done. And I think that they feel like they're, again, like in charge. For some of them, I had to scaffold it and kind of help them make a list of some of the things they could pick from. But then, and they would kind of sequence them and put them in, and then telling them, like, if you make the list and you don't want to, then change it. If you were going to do something with your linear algebra and you don't feel up to it, then do some of your science work. And the students have responded really well to that. All right. What about ideas around engaging interactive activities when you're 6 feet apart? I did put, it'll be on the resource page, and I put into that document you were just in. I started compiling, as I talked to different teachers, games and activities that folks are using. But I wondered if any of the groups had talked about this and had anything to share.
I still do use dice games. Actually, I just got a game called Tenzi that has all these different colored dice. And so each student has their own set of dice and keep it in their little individual bins. And then I also got individual whiteboards for like $1 at Target. And so we can play games and things with them holding up answers. Instead of going up and like writing on the board, they write them on those. And those also they keep all the time in their individual bin. Decks of playing cards. Man, if you go to the casino, you can get used decks for free. Just saying. And so each person can then also have their own deck of cards. So you can do a lot of those games that I use for language, because I teach English as a second language. Where they can still lay cards down in front of them, and we can use them in contests and stuff. But it's basically been a matter of trying to collect materials for everybody and not spend a lot of money.
I think that's a great, first of all, I'm so glad you mentioned that. It took me forever to realize that I could just give everyone their own dice. I was like, and then the game can be played, like, we don't be holding the same dice. Yeah, so that's great. The decks of cards is such a good idea. Yeah, and I think also it is worth mentioning, I don't know if there's administrators on the call, but we need, there's gonna be a cost to teaching in person right now, because we need individualized materials. For us, we had to buy some books that we had originally had students sharing, but now they're gonna have to each have their own. Because previously we could say you use it for the first half of class, you use it for the second, but now they each need their own, because they're not supposed to be passing it back and forth. Yeah, that's great. Anyone else?
I think when students are working ahead in materials, it's really nice if they know that they don't have to do a section on their own. Like you're working on the next few pages, but it's fine to just put a post-it on it or a virtual post-it and say, I'll do this later, or I'm not sure how to start this one, or ask a specific question.
Nice.
Like you can
So,
keep working, you can skip parts. I think that's an element of
and
choice.
then are you coming back? So Milo, are you circulating and you're coming back to the student and saying, so would you put a post-it on?
Yes, absolutely. And we have GED pairs working together, so the tutor often looks at those post-its before they've worked together.
Mm.
So they'll see like, oh, the student didn't want to attempt this writing section without the tutor. So we'll work on bullet points, and then you can turn those bullet points into complete sentences.
So that's kind of back to that choice and control, right?
When we do group activities, we often do like a countdown before you answer, like don't say the answer until you get to 3. This could be for students studying 100 questions for citizenship, or English students where it's multiple choice or they're just a few answers. I think they're less hesitant to say it if a bunch of people are saying something in unison. And we're still online, but I think that would work in hybrid or in-person models too.
Thanks. Okay. Would anyone want to talk about ideas that their group discussed about keeping a warm and connected community within the classroom?
I think it's an opportunity for students to be connected more and use a lot of words of encouragement and helpfulness, because as teachers, that's what we do anyway. And I think the more encouragement, sincere, not just saying words, but sincere encouragement we can give, that creates a warmth in a classroom.
Thanks, Diane. I think that's really useful. I do think there's a lot of people having a hard time right now, and that's definitely part of it. I put in the document, Sarah Vanderwerf is a educator in Minneapolis, and she, for the first week of class, did what she calls their name, like under their name tense, she had the students every day write her something and she would write them back. It's really short, it's like 2 sentences. And I modified that. I don't have like a first week because students are coming and going. So I just ask my students every week, we call it the dialogue sheet, and they write something and I write them back. And so I have a turn-in box on my desk. Sometime during the week, they're each expected to just write something on the paper and drop it in. And sometimes it depends on the student. Sometimes it's very functional. Like, I don't feel like my reading is improving fast enough. What's something else I could be doing? And sometimes it's more personal. Like, I got really bad news about my mom today. Sometimes it is something ridiculous. Like, I fart a lot and I'm gonna tell you I need to go look at the poster in the hallway when I have to step outside and do that. And it lets me have a place to build a little more personal connection. And I wonder if something like that would be helpful for folks that are looking for a way to make contact with students, especially new students, when there aren't just as many opportunities to do that. I wonder if there are issues that came up. We only have a couple minutes left, as you guys discussed kind of things you're facing that we didn't address in the session so far, questions that got raised or good ideas that got shared.
Abby, may I ask quickly about your name tense?
Yes.
Is
absolutely.
that in person?
I do that in person, but I think it would also work online. I teach at a correctional facility, so everything is in person, but
Okay.
I think you could do it online too. And there,
Are there concerns about touching the same piece of paper? Are there concerns about
That's a good question.
materials?
So you'll see in the resource page, there is the acronym is REALM. There's an organization. So it's the discussion sheet is just between me and the student. So the other students aren't sharing it. There's an organization called REALM that says that they're doing research for libraries and for like museums and archives about how long COVID stays on materials. And some of it is relevant for us because they're looking at like, books and other materials. The research seems to say that if stuff has been sitting for a week, there's probably, or even for papers, it's like a few days, there's not that much risk. So my students put it in a box and I get it back to them by the end of the next week. I'm already sitting with my students while they're doing work, so I'm touching their papers anyway. So I'm responding usually within a day or two. But if that was a concern, I think you could leave it in the box for the weekend and then score it the next week. And the research from Realm seems to suggest that most of the COVID isn't on there by the time, or as I don't know, the virus has died, I guess it's died by the time a week has passed. And I did link that in the resource page. So you'll be able to kind of look at some of their research. The epidemiologist I spoke to also said immediate shared contact materials, not wearing your mask. She said those were much higher risks than a paper that has been sitting overnight. So. And I see Randy's nodding and she's our science guru, so. Other questions, other things that came up? All right, well, this is from Rosie Sharkey, who is in Northfield, and I thought it was a very positive frame on where we're at. And I know we have a lot of figuring out to do. And again, I thank you for taking on the burden of that work. Andy or Marissa, if you would share the link in the chat to that last document. So this is the document where I compiled the teacher ideas. And maybe in the last few minutes, you can look over that. If it sparks other things that you want to add, the document should be live so you can add things to it. If you have questions about it, you can turn your mic on and we can talk about it, or you can add things to the chat. At the very bottom, you'll find the Minnesota Department of Health's decision tree about how to address when a staff or student is showing COVID symptoms or you think they've been exposed. I heard that it is very clear. So if your facility is, or your location is trying to figure out how to do this, the Department of Health has already done it for us and it's very clear. If someone's been exposed, they need to be out of the program for 14 days. And there's really clear guidelines there. So I think that if you don't have that, I think that is very helpful. But there's also some really great ideas on really specific things. When I was thinking about opening up the in-person instruction, it was really helpful for me to hear what other teachers had already thought through. So I think we're at the very end. I'll stick around for a little bit. If you want to reach me to talk about how things are going or what you're doing in your classroom, I always like to hear it. I really enjoy talking to the other teachers about kind of what they're doing. And thank you so much on a really beautiful Friday on a very long roller coaster of a week, spending this time together. I hope to get to see you guys in person or virtually soon.